In the spring of 1718, the Caribbean was not a paradise of azure waters and sun-bleached sands. It was a territory of fear. The sea lanes, the very arteries of the British Empire, were hemorrhaging gold, sugar, and rum. This bleeding was not caused by storms or navigational error, but by a single man who had willed himself into a living legend, a specter of sulphur, smoke, and dread. His given name was Edward Teach, but the world, from the shivering merchants of Charleston to the anxious lords of the Admiralty in London, knew him only as Blackbeard. Blackbeard was more than a pirate. He was a master of psychological warfare, a maestro of terror. A man of hulking physique, he cultivated an image of demonic fury. His great black beard, thick and untamed, was braided into menacing pigtails, often tied with black ribbons. Before battle, he would tuck slow-burning cannon fuses under the brim of his hat, weaving them into his beard and hair. He would advance on his prey, wreathed in a halo of acrid smoke, his eyes glinting like hell coals in the gloom, a figure seemingly conjured from the abyss itself. This theatricality was his greatest weapon. It often won him his prize without a single shot fired, as crews surrendered in sheer terror rather than face the devil incarnate. His flagship, the Queen Anne's Revenge, was a monster in its own right. A captured French slaver refitted with 40 cannons, she was one of the most formidable vessels in the Americas, outgunning all but the Royal Navy's ships of the line. With a fleet of smaller sloops and a loyal crew of hardened cutthroats, Blackbeard had become not just a nuisance, but a sovereign power, a king of a floating, lawless nation. The apex of his audacity, the act that finally broke the Crown's patience, came in May 1718. In a move of unparalleled arrogance, Blackbeard sailed his fleet to the mouth of Charleston Harbor, the busiest and most prosperous port in the Carolinas, and blockaded it. For nearly a week, no ship could enter or leave. He was holding an entire colonial capital hostage. He plundered vessels at his leisure, seizing cargo and, more importantly, prominent citizens whom he held for a bizarre ransom, not gold, but a chest of medicine for his crew who were suffering from venereal diseases. The message was clear and terrifying. This was not mere piracy. This was a challenge to the authority of the British Empire itself. Blackbeard was demonstrating that he could strangle colonial commerce at will. The news traveled on the swift wings of merchant ships up the coast to Virginia, where it landed on the desk of a man who possessed neither fear of demons nor patience for chaos, Governor Alexander Spotswood. Spotswood was a man forged in the crucible of European wars. A former soldier who had fought under the Duke of Marlborough, he was pragmatic, ruthless, and fiercely protective of his colony's prosperity. He saw Blackbeard not as a romantic rogue, but as a cancerous tumor on the body of colonial trade. The blockade of Charleston was a direct threat to Virginia's own economic health. Worse, it was a profound humiliation for the Crown. The problem was jurisdiction. Blackbeard, after receiving his ransom and mockingly releasing his prisoners, had sailed north and sought refuge in the neighboring colony of North Carolina. There, Governor Charles Eden and his secretary Tobias Knight were widely suspected of being in league with the pirate. It was an open secret that Eden provided Blackbeard with a royal pardon and a blind eye in exchange for a share of his spoils. Bath Town had become a pirate sanctuary, a place where Teach could live as a landed gentleman between his voyages of terror. For Spotswood, this was an intolerable situation. The law was being subverted by corruption from within. To appeal to London would take months, a delay the colonies could not afford. To ask Governor Eden to arrest his own business partner was laughable. Spotswood decided on a third path, a course of action that was legally dubious but militarily decisive. He would act unilaterally. He would fund a private expedition, sanctioned by his authority as governor of Virginia, to hunt down and eliminate Blackbeard in North Carolina's sovereign waters. It was an act of political aggression, a violation of colonial law, but Spotswood deemed it a necessary evil to excise a greater one. He needed a commander, not a brash captain seeking glory, but a man of discipline, intelligence, and unwavering resolve. He needed an instrument of the Crown's will, a man who represented everything Blackbeard was not: order, duty, and cold professional competence. His search led him to the naval station on the James River and to a first lieutenant of His Majesty's ship Pearl. His name was Robert Maynard. Maynard was not a man given to grand gestures or fiery speeches. He was of middling height, with a lean, wiry frame that spoke of naval discipline rather than brute strength. His face was sharp, his eyes a cool, observant gray that missed little. He was a career officer, a man whose world was defined by the precise geometry of navigation, the rigid hierarchy of the quarterdeck, and the unyielding articles of war. He saw the world in shades of romance and adventure, but in terms of problems and solutions, of order to be maintained and chaos to be suppressed. When summoned to the governor's palace in Williamsburg, Maynard stood with quiet confidence before the formidable Spotswood. The governor, pacing before a large map of the colonies, laid out the situation with blunt clarity. "Lieutenant, you are aware of the pirate Teach, who calls himself Blackbeard. He has made a mockery of the king's law. He has throttled trade, threatened our neighbors, and now he rests comfortably in North Carolina under the wing of a corrupt governor. The official channels are compromised. The law has failed." Spotswood stopped and fixed Maynard with an intense gaze. "I am therefore stepping outside the law to enforce it. I am commissioning an expedition to enter North Carolina's waters, find Teach, and bring him to justice, by which I mean to the end of a rope or the point of a sword. This will not be an official Royal Navy action. It will be funded by me and the Council of Virginia. It is a dangerous, clandestine mission. If you fail, or if you are captured, the Crown will disavow you. You will be on your own." Maynard listened without expression, his hands clasped behind him in parade ground stillness. He understood the implications perfectly. This was not a commission for glory. It was a contract for an execution. It was a dirty, high-risk affair that could end his career or his life with no official recognition. Spotswood continued, "I have secured 2 civilian sloops, the Ranger and the Jane. Your frigate, the Pearl, draws too much water for the shallow sounds and inlets where Teach makes his lair. You will man these sloops with volunteers from your own ship and from HMS Lyme. You will have no cannons. They have been removed to lighten the vessels for the shoals. You will be armed only with small arms and your wits. You will be outnumbered and outgunned. Your only advantage will be the element of surprise. No cannons against the man whose flagship was a floating fortress. It was a suicide mission, but Maynard's mind was already working, processing the tactical challenges. The shallow draft was indeed an advantage, the key to a surprise attack. Blackbeard would expect a frigate, a lumbering beast he could easily outmaneuver in the coastal labyrinth he knew so well. He would never expect 2 small, seemingly harmless trading sloops to be filled with heavily armed Navy sailors. The lack of cannons was a weakness, but also part of the deception. For Maynard, this was not about personal vengeance. He had no feud with Teach. His was the abstract, professional vengeance of the system itself. Blackbeard was an aberration, a glitch in the ordered machine of empire. His quiet demeanor concealed a will of cold iron. "I understand the risks, Your Excellency," Maynard said, his voice steady and clear, "and I understand the objective." Spotswood nodded, a flicker of approval in his eyes. "I am not asking you to capture him, Lieutenant. I am authorizing you to kill him. Bring me his head, and you will have the thanks of this colony and a handsome reward. Fail, and your name will be forgotten." Maynard's gaze did not waver. "When do I sail?" The pact was sealed. An instrument of order had been unleashed against an agent of chaos. The hunt had begun.
As Maynard left the governor's palace, the weight of the mission settled on him, not as a burden, but as a clear, defined purpose. He was no longer just a naval officer performing his duties. He was the crown's retribution, sailing into the serpent's lair to cut off its head.
Part 2. The Serpent's Coil. The journey south from the James River was a study in contrasts. Aboard the two hired sloops, Jane and Ranger, Maynard and his hand-picked crew of 55 sailors and Marines shed the polished veneer of the Royal Navy. They were a wolf pack, disguised in sheep's clothing. The sloops, designed for carrying tobacco and timber, were awkward and cramped for fighting men. The decks were clear of the comforting bulk of naval cannons, leaving them feeling naked and vulnerable. Their only armament consisted of muskets, pistols, and cutlasses, carefully stowed below deck, out of sight. Maynard's strategy was built on a foundation of meticulous intelligence and deception. He knew that a frontal assault with his small force would be madness. He had to become a hunter, not a soldier, learning the habits and patterns of his prey before striking. His first destination was the convoluted network of sounds and inlets of North Carolina, the vast, shallow inland sea where Blackbeard felt most secure. Their entry into North Carolina's waters was a clandestine act. They sailed under the guise of merchantmen, their naval uniforms packed away. Maynard knew Governor Eden's spies and lookouts would be watching. Any sign of a naval expedition would send a warning rider galloping to Bath Town, and Blackbeard would melt away into the maze of swamps and islands. Maynard established a temporary hidden base in the lower reaches of the Pamlico Sound, far from the prying eyes of Bath. From here, he began the painstaking process of gathering information. He sent out small scouting parties and longboats, disguised as fishermen, to map the treacherous shoals and channels, and to listen for whispers of the pirates' whereabouts. The atmosphere in the coastal towns was thick with fear and complicity. Blackbeard was both a monster and a local benefactor. He spent his stolen gold freely in the taverns and shops of Bath, and the locals, either through fear or greed, protected him with a wall of silence. Maynard found himself navigating a world of whispered conversations, shifty eyes, and half-truths. Every stranger was a potential informant, every friend of a stranger a potential traitor. His breakthrough came in the form of a disgruntled former trader whose cargo had been unjustly seized, not by Blackbeard, but by the corrupt customs official Tobias Knight. The man, seeking his own form of revenge, agreed to speak with Maynard under the cover of darkness. They met on a deserted stretch of beach, the only light from a sliver of moon. "He's at Ocracoke," the trader whispered, his voice hoarse. "He's beached the Adventure, his new sloop. He's hosting a grand revel, a gathering of pirates from all over the coast. They've been drinking and feasting for days. He feels untouchable there." Ocracoke Inlet. It was the perfect lair. A narrow, treacherous passage to the Atlantic, protected by shifting sandbars and shallow waters that only an experienced local pilot could navigate. It was a natural fortress, easily defended. "How many men?" Maynard asked, his voice low and calm. "With Teach, no more than 20 on his sloop, but there are others on the island. Other crews. If they rally to him, you will be facing 100 men or more." This was the critical piece of intelligence. A small core crew bloated with rum and arrogance. The other pirates were a wild card, but if Maynard could strike fast enough, he might deal with Blackbeard before they could react. What of his defenses? "The Adventure is armed with 8 cannons, the trader said, a shiver in his voice. "Even at anchor, she can blow your little sloops out of the water before you get within pistol shot." Maynard's mind raced. The cannons were the primary threat. His plan had to neutralize them. The only way to do that was to get so close, so fast, that they couldn't be brought to bear effectively. And the only way to do that was to use the treacherous shoals, the very things that made Ocracoke a fortress,
as his weapon. Returning to his ships, Maynard gathered his officers, First Mate Mr. Hyde of the Jane and an officer named Baker in command of the Ranger. He laid out his plan, his finger tracing lines on a crude, hand-drawn map of the inlet. "We will approach at dawn," he explained. "We'll use the tide to carry us in. The Ranger will move along the western shore to cut off any escape into the Sound. My sloop, the Jane, will make a direct approach. He will see us coming, but he will underestimate us. He will see two small trading sloops and assume we are easy prey." Mr. Hyde, a veteran, with a face like weathered oak, stroked his chin. "He will fire on us, Lieutenant. Without cannon to return fire, we'll be torn to shreds." "He will," Maynard agreed, "which is why we will not give him a clear target. We will hug the shallows, and we will provoke him. I need him to make a mistake. I need him to become overconfident." He paused, letting the audacity of his plan sink in. "Our only chance is to force him to board us. We must turn our greatest weakness, our lack of firepower, into a lure." The plan was a gamble of breathtaking proportions. It relied on precise timing, perfect navigation through deadly waters, and the assumption that Blackbeard's arrogance would override his tactical sense. For the next several days, Maynard drilled his men relentlessly. They practiced silent running, muffling their oars for the final approach. They rehearsed their roles in the trap he was laying. Every man knew his station. Every man knew that hesitation would mean death. The atmosphere aboard the sloops was a mixture of grim determination and nervous tension. They were hunting a legend, and they were all acutely aware that they might not return. On the evening of November 21st, 1718, everything was in place. A favorable tide was predicted for the morning. The moon would be new, providing maximum cover for their approach. Maynard addressed his crew for the last time. He stood on the cramped deck of the Jane, a lantern casting long, flickering shadows. "Men," he began, his voice carrying clearly in the still night air, "tomorrow we face Edward Teach. You know his reputation. They say he is a demon. They say he cannot be killed. But tomorrow we will show him that he is a man of flesh and blood, and that he is subject to the king's law like any other." He looked from face to face, meeting the eyes of the young sailors and the hardened Marines. "We are outgunned. We are outnumbered if his allies join him, but we have surprise, we have discipline, and we have justice on our side. Follow your orders. Trust in your training. Do not fire until you are given the command. We will lure him in, and when he boards, we will rise up and send him and his crew to hell. For the crown, for the colony of Virginia, for every honest sailor who has suffered at his hands." There were no cheers, only a low, determined murmur of assent. These men were professionals. They understood the stakes. As the night deepened, they made their final preparations, sharpening cutlasses, checking the flint and powder of their pistols and muskets. Maynard retired to his small cabin, but not to sleep. He sat with his map, going over the plan again and again, anticipating every possible contingency. He felt the cold, familiar knot of pre-battle tension in his stomach, but his mind was sharp and clear. This was the culmination of his professional life, the ultimate test of his skills. He was the surgeon, and Blackbeard was the disease. The operation was scheduled for dawn.
Part 3. The Devil at Ocracoke. The pre-dawn hours of November 22nd were unnaturally still. A thick gray mist clung to the surface of the Pamlico Sound, muffling all sound and reducing visibility to a few boat lengths. It was a gift. Under the cloak of this fog, Maynard's two sloops, the Jane and the Ranger, slipped through the water like ghosts, their oars wrapped in cloth to prevent any sound from carrying across the water. Maynard stood at the helm of the Jane, his senses on high alert. He could taste the salt and dampness in the air. Beside him, a local pilot he had hired, a man who knew these waters intimately, gave quiet instructions, guiding them through the invisible maze of sandbars that guarded the entrance to Ocracoke Inlet. The fate of the mission rested on this man's knowledge and nerve. As the first pale hint of dawn began to bleed through the eastern fog, they saw it. A dark, solid shape materializing from the mist like a phantom. It was the Adventure, Blackbeard's sloop, anchored placidly in the channel. A thin curl of smoke rose from its galley stove, the only sign of life. The trap was set. As planned, Baker steered the Ranger towards the far side of the inlet, a blocking maneuver. Maynard steered the Jane on a direct course for the pirate vessel. The quiet was shattered by a cry from the Adventure's deck. "A sail! A sail off the port bow!" They had been spotted. The element of surprise was partial, but the deception was still in play. From the deck of the Adventure, they would see only two small, unassuming merchant sloops emerging from the fog. A hulking figure appeared at the rail of the Adventure. Even at this distance, he was unmistakable. It was Blackbeard. He raised a speaking trumpet to his lips, his voice booming across the water, a sound of raw, confident power. "Who are you, and from whence ye came?" Maynard had anticipated this. He had instructed one of his sailors to give the standard, non-threatening reply. "We are traders from the James River." There was a pause, then a great booming laugh from the pirate ship. Blackbeard knew no naval vessels patrolled these waters. He saw an easy prize delivered to his doorstep by the morning tide. "You villains, who are you?" This time, Maynard answered himself, his voice sharp and clear, a formal challenge. "You may see by our colors we are no pirates." At his signal, the white ensign of the Royal Navy was run up the mast of the Jane. The reaction from the Adventure was instantaneous. The leisurely mood vanished, replaced with frantic activity. The ruse was revealed. Blackbeard knew he was facing the Navy. But his arrogance held. He saw two small sloops with no visible cannons. This was not a threat. It was an insult. He shouted an order. "Damn you for villains! I will neither give nor take quarter." As he spoke, a puff of white smoke erupted from the side of the Adventure, followed by the deep-throated boom of a cannon. The shot was hasty and high, screaming over their heads and splashing harmlessly into the sound. It was followed by another, and then another. The Adventure's full broadside of 4 cannons had fired. Maynard held his course, ordering his men to stay low. The air filled with the whistle of cannonballs and the splintering of wood as shot tore through their rigging. They were absorbing the punishment, just as he had planned. Then disaster struck. As the Jane pressed forward, there was a sickening lurch and a grinding crunch. They had run aground on a hidden sandbar. The Ranger, in its maneuvering, suffered the same fate moments later. They were stuck, helpless, stationary targets sitting squarely in the pirates' killing field. A roar of triumph went up from the Adventure. Blackbeard had them trapped. He ordered his men to reload. He was going to demolish them where they sat. Maynard's mind worked with icy speed. This was the moment of crisis, the point where the plan could collapse into a massacre. His crew looked to him, their faces pale in the dawn light. "Hold your positions," he commanded, his voice betraying no panic. "He's coming to us." Blackbeard, seeing his enemy crippled, decided to finish the job personally. Instead of simply pounding them with cannon fire from a distance, he cut his anchor cable and let the tide carry the Adventure towards the stranded sloops. It was a move of pure, contemptuous arrogance, the very mistake Maynard had been counting on. As the Adventure drifted closer, Blackbeard unleashed a final, devastating broadside. The cannons were loaded with swan shot, nails, and pieces of scrap metal, a horrific anti-personnel load designed to sweep a deck clear of life. The effect on the Jane was catastrophic. The hail of metal ripped across the deck with a sound like a giant scythe. Men screamed and fell. The deck was slick with blood. In an instant, Maynard's effective fighting force was cut by a third.
It was a scene of utter carnage. But this, too, was part of the plan. "Below decks! All hands below decks now!" Maynard screamed over the moans of the wounded. "Leave the dead where they lie! Move!" The surviving sailors, including Maynard himself, scrambled for the hatches, disappearing from sight. To Blackbeard, watching from the approaching adventure, it looked like his broadside had annihilated the entire crew. He saw a crippled, drifting sloop, its decks littered with bodies, apparently crewed only by the dead and dying. The trap was now perfectly baited. With a final triumphant roar, Blackbeard steered the adventure alongside the Jane. Grappling hooks were thrown, binding the two vessels together. "Let's see what we have here," Blackbeard bellowed, drawing a massive cutlass. He personally led the boarding party, leaping onto the deck of the Jane with 9 of his fiercest pirates. They landed amidst the carnage, confident that the fight was over. For a heartbeat, there was silence. The pirates stood on the blood-soaked deck, looking at the bodies, laughing. Then Maynard gave the signal, a single, shrill whistle blast. It was as if the ship itself came alive. The hatches burst open, and Royal Navy sailors erupted from below decks, a wave of bluecoats and flashing steel. The pirates' laughter died in their throats, replaced with looks of stunned disbelief. They were trapped on an enemy vessel, suddenly and hopelessly outnumbered. The fight was instant and savage. The narrow deck became a maelstrom of desperate, close-quarters combat. Pistols were fired at point-blank range, their reports deafening. The clang of cutlass on cutlass, the grunts of exertion, the screams of the wounded, it was a microcosm of hell. Maynard and Blackbeard saw each other at the same moment. The two commanders, the embodiments of order and chaos, were separated only by a few feet of bloody planking. They moved towards each other, drawn by an undeniable gravity. The swirling melee around them seemed to part, giving them a small arena for their duel. Blackbeard was a terrifying sight. The fuses in his beard were lit, sputtering and smoking, framing his snarling face in a demonic halo. He was a giant, swinging his heavy cutlass with brutal force. Maynard was smaller, quicker, relying on his naval training and precise footwork. Maynard fired his pistol first. The ball struck Blackbeard square in the chest, but the massive pirate barely flinched, as if swatting away a fly. He charged forward, his cutlass whistling through the air. Maynard parried the blow, the shock of the impact jarring his entire arm. He fired his second pistol, but Blackbeard was already too close. The pirate's return swing was a blur of motion. Maynard tried to parry again, but the sheer force of the blow shattered his naval cutlass near the hilt. He was disarmed, defenseless before the raging giant. Blackbeard raised his cutlass for the killing blow, a look of savage triumph in his eyes. This was the end. But at that precise moment, one of Maynard's sailors, a Scottish Highlander, saw his captain's plight. He lunged forward, bringing his own broadsword down across the back of Blackbeard's neck. The pirate roared in pain and fury, turning his attention to his new attacker. It gave Maynard the second he needed. He drew his backup weapon, a dirk, from his belt, and lunged forward, plunging it deep into the pirate's abdomen. Simultaneously, other sailors closed in. The Highlander struck again. Another sailor fired his pistol into Blackbeard's back. Still, the pirate titan would not fall. He fought on, a cornered, wounded bear, bleeding from more than 20 wounds, 5 from gunshots, at least 20 from blades. He staggered, drew a pistol from his own belt to shoot Maynard, but his strength finally failed him. He collapsed onto the deck, dead before he hit the wood. With the fall of their captain, the fight went out from the remaining pirates. Some were cut down, others surrendered, diving into the water in a desperate attempt to escape. The battle, which had lasted only a few terrifying minutes, was over. Maynard stood, breathing heavily, wounded and exhausted, over the body of his adversary. He looked at the fallen giant, this man who had terrorized the seas and made himself a legend. In death, The demonic aura was gone. He was just a man, his smoking beard now just a strange, sad decoration. The cost had been high. Maynard had lost
nearly a dozen men, with many more wounded, but the mission was a success. He gave the order. It was a grim, brutal task, but it was necessary to fulfill the governor's command and to provide undeniable proof of Blackbeard's demise. They severed the pirate's head from his body. The journey back to Virginia was a somber procession. The crew, bandaged and weary, was quiet. There was no celebration. As they sailed, they hung Blackbeard's head from the bowsprit of the Jane. It was a gruesome trophy, a stark and terrifying warning to any who would challenge the crown's authority. The long black beard, now matted with dried blood, swayed with the motion of the ship. When they arrived in Williamsburg, the head was delivered to Governor Spotswood. It was later displayed on a pike at the mouth of the Hampton River, a place that would forever after be known as Blackbeard's Point. The reign of the most feared pirate of the age was definitively over. Lieutenant Robert Maynard received his reward and the quiet thanks of a grateful colony. He never sought fame, and his name is not as well remembered as that of the man he killed. But for him, the victory was not in the fame or the gold. It was in the successful completion of a difficult duty. It was in the restoration of order. He had been sent to hunt a monster, and using intellect, discipline, and courage, he had faced the devil at Ocracoke and sent him back to hell. The shadow of the Kraken had been lifted from the seas, not by a hero of legend, but by a quiet, professional officer of the Royal Navy doing his job.